Let me start with something that almost no one admits out loud. Some people don't disappear because they hate everyone. They disappear because staying became heavier than leaving. At first, it doesn't look dramatic. They reply slower. They cancel plans more often. They stop explaining themselves. And then one day, they're just gone. No arguments, no long goodbye, no closure. From the outside, it feels cold, confusing, even cruel. But from the inside, it feels like survival. People who cut everyone off are often misunderstood as distant, arrogant, or emotionally closed. But the truth is usually far more human, far more complicated, and far more painful than most people realize. Because cutting people off is rarely the first choice. It's the last one. Most of these people didn't wake up one morning and decide to erase everyone from their life. What they did instead was endure. For a long time, quietly, politely, patiently. They tolerated being misunderstood. They tolerated being overextended. They tolerated being the strong one, the listener, the fixer, the emotional container for everyone else. And slowly, something inside them started to wear down. Psychologically speaking, this behavior often comes from emotional exhaustion, combined with a deep fear of being a burden. Many people who cut everyone off learned, early in life, that their needs were inconvenient, ignored, or minimized. So instead of asking for support, they adapted by becoming low maintenance. They became the person who says, "It's fine," even when it isn't. The person who doesn't complain, the person who carries things alone. Over time, this creates a dangerous pattern, because when you don't express your limits, people assume you don't have any. And that's where the breaking point begins. One of the biggest psychological drivers behind cutting everyone off is something called emotional saturation. It happens when a person has given too much for too long without feeling seen, met, or reciprocated. Imagine pouring water into a cup that already has cracks. No matter how much you pour in, it never fills. Eventually, you stop pouring, not because you don't care, but because you're empty. These individuals often replay moments in their head that seem small to others but felt enormous to them. Being talked over, being forgotten, being reached out to only when someone needs something, being praised for being strong instead of being supported. Strength, when it's never allowed to rest, turns into isolation. Another important thing to understand is that people who cut everyone off usually don't trust partial closeness. For them, relationships feel all or nothing. Either they are deeply invested or they feel unsafe. There is often no middle ground. This comes from past experiences where vulnerability was punished instead of protected. Maybe they opened up once and were dismissed. Maybe they relied on someone who disappeared. Maybe they learned that closeness always comes with pain. So eventually distance feels safer than disappointment. There's also a quiet grief that lives inside people like this. Not just grief for others, but grief for the version of themselves that used to try harder. The version that believed communication would fix things. The version that waited for people to show up. At some point, they stop explaining, not because they have nothing to say, but because they've said it too many times already. And here's something rarely talked about. Cutting people off doesn't always bring peace. Sometimes it brings silence so loud it echoes. Many people expect relief after disconnecting. And sometimes they do feel lighter at first. There's less tension, less emotional labor, less expectation. But then the loneliness creeps in, because the same walls that keep pain out also keep connection out. Psychologically, this creates an internal conflict. On one side, there's safety, on the other, there's longing. They want connection, but only the kind that doesn't cost them their well-being. This is why people who cut everyone off often struggle with guilt. Not because they regret protecting themselves, but because they still care. They still remember birthdays. They still wonder how people are doing. They just don't know how to return without losing themselves again. Another key factor is identity fatigue. Many of these individuals were placed into roles early in life. The responsible one, the mature one, the emotionally intelligent one, the one who has it together. Over time, they stopped feeling like a person and started feeling like a function. When someone's identity is built around being useful, Walking away can feel like the only way to rediscover who they are without expectations attached. Silence becomes a form of self-definition. There's also a subtle perfectionism at play. People who cut everyone off often hold themselves to impossible emotional standards. They don't want to show up halfway. They don't want to be inconsistent. If they can't be fully present, they'd rather not be present at all. So instead of showing up messy, tired, or unsure, they disappear. Not because they think others don't deserve effort, but because they believe they must earn their place by being enough. This mindset is exhausting, and it often leads to a moment where they realize disappearing feels easier than disappointing. From a neurological perspective, chronic emotional stress can push the brain into a protective state. The nervous system learns that connection equals overwhelm, so withdrawal becomes regulation. This is not weakness, it's adaptation. But adaptation without healing eventually becomes isolation. One of the saddest truths about people who cut everyone off is that many of them still deeply value relationships. They just don't trust their ability to have them without losing themselves. They are not emotionally numb, they are emotionally overloaded, they are not cold, they are tired, and they are not heartless. They are guarding what's left of their heart. There's also often a strong sense of self-awareness in these individuals. They notice patterns, they notice dynamics, they notice emotional imbalance long before others do. But awareness without boundaries turns into resentment. So instead of confronting, negotiating, or asking for change, they choose the cleanest exit they know: silence. Because silence doesn't argue back, silence doesn't misunderstand, silence doesn't demand more, but silence also doesn't heal. The danger is when cutting everyone off becomes an identity rather than a phase, when self-protection turns into avoidance, when solitude stops being restorative and starts becoming isolating. Some people convince themselves they are better alone because they've never experienced safe connection. Others confuse independence with emotional exile. And deep down, many of them are still waiting, not for apologies, not for explanations, but for proof that connection doesn't always require self-erasure. The psychology of people who cut everyone off isn't about cruelty or indifference. It's about boundaries learned too late, needs ignored too long, and strength that was never allowed to be soft. They didn't leave because they didn't care. They left because caring cost them too much. And in the quiet they create, they are often trying to answer one question they've been avoiding their entire life. How do I stay connected without disappearing inside myself? That question doesn't have an easy answer, but it's where healing begins. After the cutoff, something unexpected happens. Life gets quieter, not just on the outside, but inside too. There are fewer messages, fewer interruptions, fewer emotional negotiations, and for a while that quiet feels like relief. People who cut everyone off often describe the early phase as breathing room. Their nervous system finally slows down. The constant anticipation of being needed, misunderstood, or drained begins to fade. But then comes the second phase, the one nobody talks about. Because silence doesn't just remove noise, it removes mirrors. When you step away from everyone, you also step away from reflections of yourself. No one is there to remind you who you've been, who you're becoming, or how you affect others. And for people who already struggle with identity fatigue, this can feel both freeing and disorienting. Psychologically, humans are relational creatures. Our sense of self is shaped through connection. When connection disappears completely, the mind starts filling in gaps on its own, often with assumptions, self-criticism, and unresolved memories. That's when the thoughts start. Maybe I overreacted. Maybe I expected too much. Maybe I should have explained better. Maybe it really was all my fault. This inner dialogue can become intense because people who cut everyone off tend to be highly reflective. They replay conversations, they analyze tone, they wonder how things could have gone differently. But here's the paradox. They left because explaining never seemed to work, and now they're explaining everything to themselves. Another important shift happens emotionally. Without constant external demands, buried feelings start surfacing. Sadness that was postponed, anger that was suppressed, grief that was never processed. This is why some people feel worse before they feel better after cutting everyone off. Because distance doesn't erase emotion. It amplifies what was ignored. And this is also where many people get stuck. Instead of using solitude as a place to heal, they use it as a place to hide. They convince themselves that being alone means being strong, that needing less means growing, that independence means disconnection. But emotional growth doesn't come from cutting ties. It comes from learning how to tie them without strangling yourself. One of the biggest long-term effects of cutting everyone off is relational hypervigilance. After experiencing emotional overload, the mind becomes extremely sensitive to potential future threats. A delayed reply feels like rejection. A small misunderstanding feels like a warning sign. A request feels like pressure. So even when new connections appear, the person keeps emotional distance. They enjoy people, but they don't lean in. They listen, but they don't reveal. They stay present, but not open. This creates relationships that look functional on the surface, but feel hollow underneath. And then the person says, "I just don't connect with people anymore." But the truth is more nuanced. They connect, they just don't feel safe enough to stay. There's also a deeper fear operating quietly beneath the surface, the fear of repeating the same pattern. Many people who cut everyone off believe that if they let someone close, the cycle will restart. They'll give too much, they'll overextend, they'll lose themselves again. So instead of learning new boundaries, they choose permanent distance. This is understandable, but it's not sustainable, because humans don't heal in isolation forever. They heal in relationships that feel different from the ones that hurt them. Another psychological consequence is emotional atrophy. When you stop practicing vulnerability, it becomes harder to access. Feelings get harder to name. Needs get harder to express. Even joy can feel muted because joy often needs to be shared to feel real. Over time, the person might start to feel emotionally flat, not depressed, just disconnected. Life feels manageable, but not meaningful. And that's when the question quietly emerges. Is this peace, or am I just numb? This question scares a lot of people because it challenges the identity they built around self-protection. If cutting everyone off wasn't the solution, then what is? The answer isn't going back to how things were. And it isn't letting everyone back in. It's learning discernment. Healthy connection is not about accessibility, it's about selectivity. People who cut everyone off often never learned that they were allowed to choose who gets access to them. They thought relationships were obligations, that loyalty meant endurance, that leaving was failure. So they swung to the opposite extreme. But healing lives in the middle. It lives in learning how to say no without disappearing, how to express needs without apologizing, how to stay without shrinking. This is incredibly uncomfortable work because it requires unlearning survival strategies that once worked. And yes, cutting people off worked for a time. It protected energy. It restored control. It created space, but it was never meant to be permanent. Another layer to this psychology is grief for relationships that never became what they could have been. People who cut everyone off often grieve silently. They don't talk about it because they were the ones who left. But leaving doesn't erase loss. They grieve the friend who never showed up differently, the family member who never changed, the connection that almost worked. This grief is complicated because it mixes sadness with relief, love with disappointment, hope with finality. And unresolved grief has a way of leaking into future relationships. It creates emotional distance. It makes people cautious. It makes them hold back. That's why some people seem present but unavailable, warm but unreachable, kind but guarded. They aren't uninterested. They're protecting something that was never protected before. One of the most important realizations for people in this pattern is this. Cutting everyone off was not a character flaw. It was a response to unmet needs. But staying cut off doesn't meet those needs either. Connection doesn't have to hurt. But it does require skills that many people were never taught. Skills like communicating boundaries early instead of late. Like noticing resentment before it hardens. Like allowing others to disappoint you without internalizing it. And most importantly, like letting yourself be imperfect in relationships. People who cut everyone off often believe they must show up fully or not at all. That belief keeps them isolated because real connection happens in partial presence, in showing up tired, in saying, "I don't have much today," in being human instead of reliable. Healing doesn't mean reopening every door. It means learning how to keep some doors open without standing in the doorway bleeding. And for those who have cut everyone off, The path forward often begins quietly, with one safe person, one honest conversation, one moment of choosing connection over withdrawal, not because you're afraid to be alone, but because you're ready to be seen. The psychology of people who cut everyone off isn't about rejecting others. It's about searching for a way to belong without self-sacrifice. And when that balance is finally learned, something powerful happens. They don't disappear anymore. They don't overgive anymore. They don't vanish to feel safe. They stay, not everywhere, not for everyone, but where it matters. And that's not weakness, that's emotional maturity.